Martini mornings only on Mood Food Radio, and I can't wait to have a very special guest with me today in the Accountability Forum, and that is Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. He is a medical doctor, he is a politician, he is an activist, and he has a lot of different views and ideas that are very welcome in our community as we struggle through some big questions. And one of those big things that we are following, of course, we all are, petrol prices are up, and that is the Ukraine invasion. So welcome aboard, Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans.
Good morning, Martine.
Lovely to have you aboard. You have written a blog on the Ukraine invasion, and it received quite an interesting response. So I was happy to have you on board to talk a bit further about some of your ideas of the history of it and where it is likely to head, because a lot of people are really worried that this could turn into World War III. Is that likely?
Well, I think they'll step back from that, but I do think that Russia will completely trash Ukraine with huge loss of life. That's what I fear, and I think that's what most people are worried about.
Mm. And we are.
So I've been looking at the history of all this.
Yes.
The Ukraine's been invaded a number of times over the centuries by the Swedes, the Poles, the Austrians, and the Germans, Mm. And of course the Russians, who think it's their backyard.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we're calling it the invasion. Do Russia actually view this as an invasion, or is it's just part of their empire? This is just a buffering state for them.
Well, I think there's sort of only three countries that think in terms of empires anymore. The US, which assumes more or less that the world will be its empire, or it'll be so preeminent that it doesn't really need an empire. It sets the rules for the whole world, if you see what I'm saying. It's got the basic currency, it's got bases nearly everywhere, ships can go everywhere unchallenged. It assumes superiority in a sense, and it assumes what they're saying, that liberal democracy will triumph, that the best form of government is liberal democracy, and when the rest of the world wakes up, they'll get it too, which was the assumption under which they've been working for quite some time. They beat the Germans and the Japanese last time, then they kind of beat the Russians in the Cold War, and now, whoops, the Chinese are getting a bit out of hand, but they have assumed that they are the preeminent empire. The Chinese have felt that they are the middle kingdom and the most important, and they've been ripped off the last century or so, and they're trying to make good that. They were very humiliated by the West, so they still think in terms of themselves as a global power, and they think they're entitled to that. And of course, the Russians had the Russian Empire, which kind of imploded because of its economic inefficiency, if you want to put it that way. So there's only, I would say, those countries think in terms of empires, and the rest of the world, particularly the Germans, and probably most influentially the Germans lost the war, but the Americans after the war set up a scheme by which the whole world traded with each other, and the trade barriers came down. And the theory was, when that was set up in 1944, I think just before the war ended, Bretton Woods, was that if everybody traded, and the rich countries that were doing well would go ahead, and the countries that were going badly would go backwards.
Sure. But
there wouldn't need to be any wars. They'd readjust in a market situation. And so in a sense, the assumption that the World Trade Organization and OECD and all these institutions would allow the world to go up and down without war has been quite successful, except the Americans go and have little wars to keep their arms industry going. But there hasn't been wars between the big powers, if you see what I'm saying, because of this system. And I think the Germans particularly have done very well out of it. They've dominated Europe. I mean, you would think there were wars.
Yes. But however, the Germans are quite reliant on Russia for gas, for instance. So that they have built, and it was in this quasi philosophical notion that if everyone is trading with everyone, then everyone is friends. So that, you know, Germany does have a vested interest in Russia, and possibly
that's why the Germans, I think, were the key in this assumption, because they had basically meant that the Germans had succeeded in their system very well, and Europe had got no more wars and were getting on much better, and the Germans were dominating. So in a sense, they assumed the system. And it wasn't Angela Merkel, actually. It was her
it was her predecessor, Gorbachev.
Coalition partners. Her coalition partners were the Social Democrats. They were the ones that were keen on the Russian gas, and were keen to have the Russian gas. So in a sense, they went even further. She was a little bit more cautious in the sense that she said, hang on, the Russians, you know, how much buddy-buddy do you want to get? Well, because of the Social Democrats, they became very buddy-buddy. And as you correctly point out, about nearly 40% or certainly 35% of their energy needs are met by Russian gas, which means they have very great vulnerability if that was turned off.
It seems crazy to virtually put all your energy eggs into one basket. I mean, that's what they have virtually done. And it's not a friendly, historically friendly basket, you know, to do that. I think a lot of people are also quite worried about the China influence in backing, and the implications this might have ongoing, because a lot of people don't realise that China is very much and probably the largest neighbour of Russia.
Yes, well, historically, I think they've had distrust, but of course they're united by the common rivalry with the US. If there are three empires, if you want to say, but the Russians, I mean, I'm sorry, I hate to be blunt about this, but I mean, I think the world has worked on the assumption that the Russians are a spent force. I mean, they've got a population of 144 million, which is a reasonable sized country, but their annual GDP is only 1.6 trillion. Australia's is 1.4. So they are the Russians are the 11th biggest economy in the world, and Australia is the 13th, with Spain in between. So, you know, in terms of they've got lots of military power, but economically they're a bit of a minnow, and they're certainly pumping above their weight in terms of invading. So Ukraine's got 44 million people, Russia's got 146, so they're only 3 times as big as that.
Yes.
I mean, the difference between us and New Zealand is greater than the difference between Russia and Ukraine in population terms. So although they've got all the arms, there's not really any way that they can pacify those people and intern them if they don't want to. And I think while Ukraine has quite big differences in the sense that the people in the Western Ukraine all want to join Europe, but many of the people on the eastern side want to go to Russia, and there's quite a marked change in the people as you move across the country.
Yes.
So, but I mean, Russia will fight for Ukraine because it feels that the West is just impinging on it more and more and more, and probably the Ukrainian people are very much overall looking to the West, which of course the Russians don't like. But I mean, most of the ex-Russian Empire were glad to get out of it. And so the Russians are saying, we want some buffer states.
Yes, well, that brings us back to the whole NATO issue, in that there was a deal brokered that Russia said that none of the buffering states of the old USSR would join NATO. And of course, the US has really sort of tickled the underbelly of a grizzly bear here by then putting in some very close bases, you know, in Kazakhstan as well as Bulgaria. So, I mean, there has been some niggling, hasn't there, with this whole NATO. You know, was it an invitation? Did Ukraine ask? I mean, does Russia have right to be upset in the diplomatic negotiations in this?
Well, I think the Americans promised verbally, but not in a treaty, that they would not expand NATO eastward.
Yes.
But of course, the countries who just left Russia were worried Russia would come back if it became stronger. And so they wanted to join NATO. NATO didn't go out and hunt for them. They came and hunted for NATO, because NATO's treaty is that if you attack one of us, it's considered an attack on all of us and we'll be defending, right?
Yes.
So they wanted that shield. So if you look at the Baltic states and Poland and then Bulgaria and Romania, they all wanted to join NATO. And so NATO said yes, basically. And so you've got NATO has expanded towards Russia, and the Russians don't like that at all. And of course, Ukraine, Georgia had a revolution which seems to have been, well, from the Russian point of view, was inspired by the CIA. And they've got this thing called a color revolution, because when there's a repressive state, they all wear the same color, because it's not illegal to wear a color, you see. And the formula for having color revolutions and then putting them in this demonstrating, and then some provocateurs shoot a few policemen, the policemen shoot the crowd, and And this has been regarded as by the pro-Russians, and there's a very good documentary called Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone, in which he traces the history of this. So he's saying this, that the CIA have been involved in these revolutions, and there was one in Georgia, and then the Russians invaded Georgia. And then, of course, there was a coup in Ukraine in 2014.
Absolutely.
And the Russians then seized Crimea. And in both cases, when they seized Georgia and they seized Crimea, there were no consequences. So they got away with it. The Americans, if you think the Americans inspired those coups, I mean, and certainly there's some evidence of that proposition. Whether they would have happened anyway is another question, but sometimes things need a little push along. The Russians responded by invading Georgia and responded by grabbing Crimea. Now, Crimea, because it was a Russian naval base, had a majority of Russians anyway, so that when they did a plebiscite, they won it, and they could say that the people wanted them, but that was still part of Ukraine. So, and that had been given to them, I think, by Khrushchev, I think. It was a while ago anyway. So the Russian position is, look, they are coming right up to our underbelly, and it's unacceptable. And the point is, the Russians are willing to die for Ukraine and the Americans are not. So in terms, and the poor old Ukrainians who say we want independence, the Russians are saying, well, you can't have it, sorry. And if you think you can, we'll teach you can't. And no matter what sanctions you put on us, we're going ahead. And I fear that Russia sees it as existential. In other words, will we exist if we don't have Ukraine? And they see it as absolutely vital for their interest, and they will suffer the sanctions, kill the people, and stay there as long as they can to make the point that you can't have Ukraine, right? They're willing to do that.
How much of this, you talked about very briefly about China suffering Western humiliation. How much of this is about the perception of Western humiliation for Putin in needing to save face and carry this to the very end?
Well, there's quite a lot of people relating this to Putin's psychology of himself as a strong man, that it is very much his opinion, and he's got rid of the dissident voices in his cabinet. He's certainly got rid of the dissident voices in his media. He's got rid of the dissident voices of Navalny, and he is doing what he thinks best. And apparently he used to have sessions with historians discussing what things were, and they eventually stopped coming because his views were too
radical,
not proportional. So I think there is some. I mean, this theory that Putin's mad is sort of gathering steam, if you like. But if you look at it in historic terms from a Russian perspective, it's not completely crazy, and he is not a stupid man or a crazy man, I don't think. And he got away with. There has been progressive encroachment on Russia, and he did respond to the Georgian coup in 2008, and he did respond by taking Crimea in 2014. So it's not completely out of character, and it is about the encroachment on Russia. There's no doubt about that.
I'm concerned as well that when we talk about the nationalistic point of view here, and we talk about whether it is an invasion or whether we are liberating people, and it goes back to that old, your hero is whatever side you're on. And Putin has incredible support in Russia. And as you say, he has cleaned up the political realms for his own end. But he's also done a lot on the ground roots for Russia, and created a beyond a fan base there. And so when we talk about liberating the other countries, that they have almost welcomed him in, and so that there's, and as you say, Ukraine as well does have quite an underbelly there, who are wanting Russia as their blood brother, who were there during the Cold War, some of the older people that are wanting him in their country to help clean it up economically, put in schools, put in libraries, and follow Russia in terms of, although their GDP is very poor, comparatively, their annual salaries have gone up considerably. And once you get a taste of that, you do get quite a taste of wanting to keep that.
Well, the 2014 coup was precipitated by the refusal of the government, to the Ukraine government, to sign a free trade treaty with the EU, which certainly all the people who were Western looking wanted. But he said that would damage the trade relationship with Russia. But the people felt that they'd do better on trading with EU on free trade than they would trading with Russia, which was not. And so that was the precipitant. Now, whether the CIA got in there, but the people who say the CIA has been involved say that the CIA tried to do stuff in Libya, they tried to do stuff in the Middle East, and each time they tried to change regimes on the assumption that a liberal democracy would spring up, in Iraq and in...
they've failed miserably.
They've failed everywhere they've gone, right? Well, so the point is...
trail of destruction.
It's been a trail of failed destruction, and each time the people in the country who tried to get some democracy end up getting shot.
Yeah.
And the Americans are portrayed as foreign evil, and nationalism wins. So the people who are saying that the inevitability of liberal democracy, which was referred to by some people as liberal hegemony, that it will be inevitable, it will become liberal democracies, and that we'll join the World Trade Organization, and that there'll be free trade, and that we'll join the WTO, a World Trade Organization, and all these countries, and therefore we'll all be working together and there won't be any wars. And the American way, if you want to put it, the free trade way, will succeed. That's been the assumption of the West, and I think of Europe, and I think certainly of Germany. And the nationalism has stopped it at a local level, and I think the empire aspirations are stopping it with the Russia and the Chinese as well, and with the Americans as well. But they're saying that they've got an inevitability. So this clash is what's producing the problem, and the Ukrainians think, we'll have our own country, and of course, if it all works on just trading, it really doesn't matter how big your country is. If you're selling something into a world market and the world market's dealing with you, what your own government is and how big it is not really the big issue, because you're all in a global system, you see. So from the Ukrainians' point of view, we might as well join the global system, why not? Clashes with, and nationalism, we want to have our own country, even if it's not very big. It's not a world power or anything, we still want our own country. That's then clashing with this Russian concept of basically empire and spheres of influence.
Yes, because and much unlike other invasions, most of the Ukraines are of ethnically of that Russian stock, and the supporters in the Ukraine are pre-Ukraine borders going up. And so they do remember being part of that USSR, and do see a bit of that grass is greener on the other side and want a part of that. And so the internal struggles, which we're not really seeing played out on our media, but that is certainly going on. How is it all going to end, Arthur?
Well, I'm afraid the Russians are not going to go away whether they have sanctions or not. And I think because the Russians see it as a matter of national survival, not to mention Putin's personal survival, they will take a huge amount of suffering of sanctions before they pull back. That may send them to the negotiating table, but this idea that they'll simply, and of course the anti-tank weapons are quite successful. The Americans have given the Ukrainians. The tanks are not getting anywhere fast. But if they use big artillery and big airstrikes, they can demolish the cities. And I think they're at the stage that the question is, will they do that? And if they're being humiliated, laughed at and losing the war, the Russians, I think, will do that. I mean, they've done it in Mariupol, and there's no reason why they won't do it in Kiev and, the other big cities. So I'm very worried, and I think the rest of the world is too. And I think we should be, because, if the Ukrainians jump up and say, we promise not to join NATO, I don't think that'll be enough to satisfy Putin. And I think he's got so much riding on this now that he can't be seen not to have a victory. And that victory, given the stubborn resistance of the Ukrainians, is going to come at great cost to everybody.
It is. Arthur, as always, it's very interesting to talk to you, to hear about the history of this. It's very complex. It's not a simple issue. And it is affecting, obviously, us here in Australia. How are our petrol prices been affected?
Well, I mean, the Russians produce quite a lot of petrol, and once they're boycotted, it puts it up. And this is going to flow through. The cost of diesel is a major cost in farming as well, so that'll put food prices up, not to mention transporting the food around the place. But apparently gas is also quite important in the production of fertilizer. And so quite a lot of fertilizer, which is also produced in Germany, will put the cost of fertilizer up. That will, of course, put farm prices up and food prices up as well. So these things are all interrelated and spill across. So I think it will have quite an inflationary effect here, and wages, as you know, have been static for quite a while, and that's not making people happy, and that has political effects with the election as well.
Certainly lots of things to consider. It has been wonderful chatting to you. Can we do it all again next week?
Yeah, we'll get the technology better, quicker.
Okay, we'll get on to that. Thank you, Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. He is a medical doctor, activist, politician with views on everything and anything. We'll give you his links to his blog as well as his Facebook page, and you can have a chat further with Arthur. Until then, Arthur, have a wonderful week.
Yep.